Good afternoon, everyone. This odd world we live in, where I can now see like 3 random students' faces in the little screen that I have here. I don't know how you were chosen, but there you are. And then I'm going to start trying to, if I can, intersperse talking to you in this format with also switching to like gallery format where I can see many of you at the same time, just to give me more of a sense that I'm actually in a classroom with you. Just want to remind you all that there's this disease category exercise that we expect all of you to complete. And Maggie will remind you, or I forgot, when is the deadline, Maggie, for that?
By 5 p.m. today would be great.
Okay, so by 5 p.m. today, we need you to complete this little online exercise, which will then be made into slides and used as part of the presentation on Thursday. Okay, so last time we discussed a number of topics. We talked about different ways of measuring socioeconomic status and the variation in life expectancy according to socioeconomic status. We talked about the ways that health and socioeconomic status could be interrelated, with SES causing health and health causing SES. And we reviewed possible mechanisms for this relationship between SES and health in both directions, including such things as risk behaviors, access to healthcare, and reduced earnings, due to illness. We considered the fact that the directionality of the relationship could also vary across the life course, which is an interesting idea. And we examined some new ideas about how SES might affect health, including ideas about relative position in the social hierarchy, which we'll return to later in the class, and the issue of in utero exposures and genetic confounding, which are also topics we'll return to later in the class. And we closed with some remarks at the end about a very important and fundamental idea about the so-called fundamental causes in the social sciences, which is also an important idea that we'll return to. So I'd like to return now to an idea we introduced towards the end of the last class, having to do with the notion of a natural and social lottery. This is an excerpt from a letter that Thomas Jefferson sent to John Adams in October 28, 1813. I'm just going to read it. I'll turn to the left because that's where my screen is. It says, "For I agree with you that there is a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talents. Formerly, bodily powers gave place among the aristi, the aristocracy. But since the invention of gunpowder has armed the weak as well as the strong with missile death, bodily strength like beauty, good humor, politeness, and other accomplishments has become but an auxiliary ground for distinction. There is also an artificial aristocracy focused on wealth and birth without either virtue or talents. The natural aristocracy I consider as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, and government of society. And indeed, it would have been inconsistent in creation to have formed man for the social state and not to have provided virtue and wisdom enough to manage the concerns of the society. May we not even say that that form of government is the best, which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristi into the offices of government. The artificial aristocracy is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy." So let me restate this idea. Imagine we are setting out to create a just society, similar to the argument in John Rawls' famous theory of justice. At least a couple of immediately obvious causes of difference and of potential injustice that we would have to consider include the following. One possible cause is the natural lottery, which assigns people the natural assets with which they are born. Another phenomenon is the social lottery, which assigns people their social position at birth. And the natural lottery assigns people the natural assets, assets that can affect their life chances, for example, such as their intelligence. The social lottery is the way in which one's initial position, your family or your class background, for example, affects your opportunities. It affects how people of similar talents and abilities, as specified by the natural lottery, perform. Now, both lotteries affect people's life chances. It's important to understand this. And furthermore, because the amount of resources, this is a subtle idea, because the amount of resources in any system is finite, more advantaged groups will always command more resources than less advantaged groups, or even exploit the other groups. So if some inequality is intrinsically biological, if there's any natural lottery at all, it can be reinforced by the existence of complex social systems that necessarily involve hierarchy operating under a budget constraint. There's only so much good stuff in the world. The natural lottery creates some hierarchy. Those on the top will get better access to the finite amount of stuff that's available and might even exploit or subjugate those, quote, on the bottom. So we might rightly wish to constrain or countermand the operation of the social lottery in the name of justice. And we might even want to provide for a social counterbalance to the natural lottery too. These are deep and important philosophical ideas that relate to justice and relate to the intrinsic nature of inequality in the world and its origins and its implications that have been explored by many philosophers and social scientists for a very long time. And I'm here referring right now to John Rawls' famous theory of justice. Now, interestingly, Thomas Jefferson had given thought to this problem as well, identifying at least one way to deal with the social lottery. This is what he said. At the first session of our legislature, after the Declaration of Independence, we passed a law abolishing entails, and this was followed by one abolishing the privilege of primogeniture and dividing the lands of intestates equally among all their children or other representatives. These laws, drawn by myself, laid an axe to the root of the pseudo-aristocracy. And had another which I had prepared been adopted by the legislature, our work would have been complete. It was a bill for the more general diffusion of learning. This proposed to divide every county into wards of 5 or 6 miles square, like your townships. He's writing to John Adams, who's in New England, where the organization of space was different. Jefferson continues, to establish in each ward a free school for reading, writing, and common arithmetic, to provide for the annual selection of the best subjects from these schools who might receive at the public expense a higher degree of education at a district school, and from these district schools to select a certain number of the most promising subjects to be completed at a university where all the useful sciences should be taught. Worth and genius would thus have been sought out from every condition of life and completely prepared by education for defeating the competition of wealth and birth for public trusts. Now, I'm well aware of Jefferson's other limitations, but if you actually take seriously what he's writing here, it's an astonishing thing that he accomplished over 200 years ago, laying the foundation for public free education, an idea which was quite innovative. A free education for everyone is a way to compensate for the social lottery. And we can compensate for the natural lottery by intervening in or with the social lottery. Now, when we observe worse health, for example, in minority groups, surely most, if not all of this, is due to the social lottery, which seems manifestly unjust. But we also have to be mindful of the distinction between unequal outcomes versus unequal treatment. So if we see an ethnic or racial difference What does it mean? And do we care? Well, if we see a difference between ethnic or racial groups, for instance, in COVID-19 mortality or vaccination rates, both of which vary by ethnicity and race right now in our society, according to the Institute of Medicine, before we judge it to be problematic, we need to do the following things. So first of all, we have to adjust for other attributes. We have to say, well, is there still an effect of race and ethnicity after we take into account, let's say, socioeconomic status or insurance status, or differences in the nature of diseases that afflict different groups, comorbid conditions, or differences in disease severity or stage? In addition, before we conclude that there is some inappropriate effect of race, we have to make sure we attend to methodological features. For example, are we using good data, good clinical data? Have the data been collected prospectively? Is there an objective standard for appropriateness? And I'll come back to this point because this is often overlooked and it's really important. Is there some gold standard for us to know what is and is not good care? And finally, can we account for patient preferences? Because people vary in what kind of care they want, and we need to take that into account as well. Whether you think that some or all of these are important also depends in part on your conceptual model for how race and ethnicity work. There's abundant evidence, for example, that once you control for socioeconomic status and other factors like comorbid illness or occupation, ethno-racial differences in health status substantially decline or even disappear. In other words, if you take into account how poor people are, maybe their race or ethnicity isn't associated with how long they live. But the problem is, what does this mean? It turns out it depends upon what you think is going on, about how you think ethnicity or race might be working. And this can happen in at least two ways shown here. In the top, there are two different things, for example, race and education, each of which independently is felt to affect health. And if you want to get a pure estimate of the effect of race, in this situation, if that's your conceptual model, it makes sense to control for education. If we control for education and the effect of race disappears, that's okay. It means race has no independent effect. But in the bottom, race leads to poor education. In other words, the way race works in this situation is race compromises your educational opportunities, which in turn compromises your health. So actually, if you control for education in that scenario, you're doing the wrong thing. You're concluding wrongly that race has no impact on health or healthcare, because in fact, the way race works is precisely to compromise access, for example, to healthcare or other health opportunities. So on the bottom, race leads to poor education, and therefore controlling for the effects of education effaces the effect in a potentially misleading way. Here, race is still causal, but we've made it disappear for the wrong reasons. Race is on the causal path via education to health in the bottom model. For example, what if someone tells you that after taking into account the quality of the ingredients, the expertise of the chef, the ambience of the restaurant, and so on, we find that a meal at McDonald's offers just the same experience as a meal at a super fancy restaurant? Like, after you take into account all of that stuff, there's no difference, you say, between a McDonald's and a super fancy restaurant. And that could well be true, but that's not the point. And that is not what we want to do by adjusting for other factors here. You would find it silly to say, well, after you took into account the ambience and the chef and the ingredients, there's no difference. You say, no, that's why McDonald's is worse. It's because it has those procedures, for example, those features. So what does this, what's important to understand here is that in both cases shown here, controlling for education will typically reduce the impact of race, for example, on health or healthcare. And the question then becomes, what does this mean about the causal status of race and ethnicity? In the bottom, giving everyone a free and good education will solve the problem of race. Whereas in the top, race might still have its own effect, even if you gave everyone, even if you rectified all the educational injustice in our society. Do you understand the difference? In the bottom, we say, aha, this is how race is having these, awful effects. We're going to provide a free education and undo the workings of the social lottery. But in the top, even if you do that, race might still have an effect, and so you would not be able to efface its effect. And I don't want to overdo the correspondence, but in the top, race is part of the natural lottery, and in the bottom, it's part of the social lottery. Now, here's a similar example. Let's say there are two different factors that affect your weight, your sex and your height. If you control for height, you might conclude that sex has no effect on weight, for example. But you would say, wait a minute, that's stupid. In fact, the way sex affects weight is by men are taller. That's why they're heavier. That's the whole point, you would say. So how you understand what it means to control for certain factors depends on what conceptual model you bring to the social processes that are here. And as you can all probably imagine, it's very difficult and confusing because, of course, both could also be true. Both of these things could be what's going on in the same situation. And it's very difficult to sort this out phenomenologically, conceptually, but also statistically. Now, before proceeding, I need to say that it can be very hard to talk about race and ethnicity. And on the one hand, these should not matter. They should not matter. In fact, I wrote a whole book about our common humanity, which you'll read parts of. Maybe, I can't remember if it's in this class or not, if I assign Blueprint. Do I assign Blueprint in this class? I can't remember, Maggie. No, I don't. Anyway, so on the one hand, they shouldn't matter because, we're all human beings. And that is, in fact, the most important. Our commonalities are the most important. So talking about race and ethnicity reifies it, privileges it, and reinforces its importance. And reasons not to talk about race include that it overstates the role of ethnicity and race as reflecting genetic or biological differences between population groups, which are very few, that it fails to reflect the fluid and dynamic nature of sociopolitical identity for many people, that it fails to reflect the way many Americans choose to define themselves, and that it contributes to divisions in our society in ways that harm us all. On the other hand, it does seem to matter. Race and ethnicity do seem to matter when it comes to health. So not talking about it can also appear irresponsible and blind, as if you don't care about the topic, which doesn't make sense either and isn't right. So how to thread this needle? Well, let's try to put some facts on the table about what we can and cannot know and what is and is not known about the role of race and ethnicity in health outcomes and inequality in our society. So this slide shows the effect of adjustment for level of education on the disparity in potential life years lost between Black people and white people according to the specific cause of death. So here we just plot the racial disparity in life years lost per 1,000 persons. And here, for example, is cardiovascular disease. So this is the adjusted for age and sex. So let's take into account, let's say that Blacks are younger than whites on average. So we need to take age into account and sex into account. And when we do that, we find that there's a pretty significant difference between Blacks versus whites. Blacks are more likely to die of cardiovascular disease than whites. And then when we take into account the educational differential between the groups, that difference declines. We see that Blacks are more likely to die of cancer than whites. But when we take education into account, there's no difference between Blacks and whites. So otherwise, similar Blacks and whites of similar age, sex, and education have similar risk of cancer. And you can go on and on. Infection, lung disease, diabetes, renal disease, and so forth and so on. And in every case, or most cases, adjusting for education lowers the gap. And it decreases the Black-white difference in cardiovascular disease, and it eliminates the disparity in cancer. But whether you think this solves the issue or addresses the issue of race depends on your causal model, as we said. If this is your model, then this is good news. Adjusting for education shows race doesn't matter. But if this is your model, or if this is the reality, then adjusting for education is deluding you, is taking you away from the truth, making you think that race doesn't matter, where in fact it does matter, because the way it's increasing, the way race, for example, increases the risk of death from cardiovascular disease in Blacks, let's say, is precisely because it compromises their educational opportunities. So adjusting for education decreases, as I said, the Black-white difference in some things and not others. And whether you think this solves the issue depends on the causal model you bring to the data. Well, let's get a handle on Black-white differences in the use, for example, of medical procedures. Here's some data based on the review of a large sample of patients' administrative records. So we're now going to look at the Black-white difference, not just in diseases like the previous slide, but in what the healthcare system offers to Blacks versus whites. Procedures per thousand, and in Blacks versus whites. So angioplasty is an expensive procedure where you thread a catheter through the person's arteries up to a particular location in their body, let's say their coronary arteries, and expand the balloon to fix a blockage. This is the Black rate, this is the white rate. Blacks get it at half the rate of whites. How about coronary bypass surgery? They get it at 40% the rate of whites. Mammography, 66% the rate of whites. Hip fracture repair, very hard to explain a difference here. If you break your hip, you need a repair. Your race should be completely irrelevant to whether you get a hip fracture repair. Blacks get it at 42% the rate of whites. Limb amputation, for example, for diabetes, Blacks get it at 3.5 times higher rate than whites. And bilateral orchiectomy, that's removal of both testicles, Blacks get it at 2.4 times at a higher rate than whites. This is a procedure done for prostate cancer, the removal of testicles to reduce the testosterone. So you look at some of this stuff and it begs questions, right? I mean, you have to say, okay, what's going on here? How can I explain some of these differences? Are they tolerable differences, or are they with some rational explanation, or are they intolerable difference that reflect the vile workings of a society gone awry? And of course, these differences may reflect complex mixes of disease prevalence. If prostate cancer is much more common in Blacks than whites, we shouldn't be surprised to see this difference. If diabetes is much more common in Blacks than whites, because a lot of the limb amputations are done for diabetic, because of diabetic vasculopathy, the blood supply to the extremities, the feet, for example, declines in diabetes. If diabetes is more common in Blacks than whites, and we adjust for that, we might say, oh, that's the explanation. That's not so bad. It's not that there's discrimination. It's that they have more diabetes, and that's the treatment for extremities that are, falling off because of diabetes. Or maybe it's patient preferences for these things, or the workings of the healthcare system, or not. Ipso facto, seeing these numbers, while provocative, doesn't answer the question of what's going on, not yet. And in fact, certainly, many African Americans have perceived a difference in access to care, and also whites do too, but to a lesser extent. This slide shows data regarding the answer to the following question. Do you think the average African American is better off, worse off, or just about as well off as the average white person in terms of access to healthcare? So this question was asked of whites and Blacks. Here is it's a histogram. And so about 10% of Blacks think that Blacks are better off, and than whites. 25% thinks they're about the same, but 60% of Blacks feel like they're worse off. And then you go to whites and you get about 10% think they're better off, of whites think that Blacks are better off, and 50% think they're about the same, less think they're worse off, and so on. So two different distributions in the assessment by race of the availability of healthcare to Blacks. But on the other hand, some other work on the extent to which race determines use of teaching hospitals finds that African Americans have much higher than expected use of teaching hospitals. They have higher access to such elite hospitals. Does anyone know why? Why might African Americans have why might African Americans have higher access to like Yale Hospital and Harvard, and Brigham and Women's Hospital and Johns Hopkins University and so on? Yes, who just popped up in my screen? Maggie, would you call on the person?
Go ahead, Alex.
Because teaching hospitals would tend to be in more urban and population dense areas.
Yes, that's one of the reasons. Insofar as Blacks are more likely to live in urban areas and rural areas, and insofar as teaching hospitals are more likely to be located in urban than rural areas, then we have better access for Blacks than whites on average across the country. We'll come back to this little wrinkle in a moment because it's subtle and important, precisely for this reason. That would be a kind of benign reason. Like if that were the case, we wouldn't mind it so much. What would be a not so benign reason for this difference? Maybe 100 years ago when the teaching hospitals were established, they were located in places where they had easy access to poor people who would then come in as patients to the free hospital. And that inequality would now be reflected 100 years later. It's not a coincidence, in other words, that many of these elite teaching hospitals are near high concentrations of poor or minority groups. Now, even if that were the reason, which let's say is not a good reason, we might still not worry about it because we might say, wait, well, that's incredible. Poor Black people in Baltimore can walk into the emergency room at Johns Hopkins and get access to the best doctors in the world. So even if it were, let's say, for bad reasons, we might still not object. And this is what it requires subtlety of thinking when we begin to assess these difficult topics. So in other words, the perceptions are that by Blacks and whites are that Blacks are worse off on average, but there are some data that in some ways they might be better off in fact. So it's confusing. But just because there's a difference doesn't mean, in other words, that they're problematic. There are several sources of difference, only some of which we might regard as bad. For example, here are potential sources of disparities in care. Patient level factors, for example, patient preferences, refusal of treatment, poor adherence, or some biological differences. Or health systems factors, for example, financing, structure of care, or cultural and linguistic barriers. For example, we wouldn't think it was fair if you got worse care because you didn't speak good English, right? That does not seem like a sound basis for the just delivery of healthcare. If you speak English, oh, we're going to give you good care. And if you don't, we're not. We would reject that, right, on moral grounds. That wouldn't be a right reason. So that we would say, well, that's a health system level factor. We don't like that. Whereas if a patient said, I don't want this type of care, and if that differed by ethnic groups, we might not think that's bad. Patients should be able to choose what they want for themselves. And finally, doctor level factors, which are disparities arising from the clinical encounter itself. And as we saw last time with the Back to Sleep campaign, we saw that sometimes low socioeconomic status can be associated with poor adherence or patient level choice in some sense. So the situation looks like this. This is, I think, taken from your readings. Or no, actually, this is not taken from your readings. This shows the possible explanations for a racial difference. Here we look at the quality of healthcare. We would, ex ante, we would agree that there should be no discrimination based on race in the quality of care given to patients. And we might find that non-minority patients have a higher quality of care than minority patients, and this would be the difference. Well, what could explain this difference? Part of it could be clinical appropriateness and need. Maybe they're different diseases. Maybe diabetes is more prevalent in Blacks than whites, so they get a different kind of care on average. Or patient preferences. Maybe Blacks are less likely to want a COVID vaccine than whites on average, and therefore we shouldn't be shocked when we find lower COVID vaccine prevalence in Blacks than whites. We can't force people to be vaccinated. We can't find them and inject them, right? We have to offer the vaccine to them fairly, but if they refuse, that's up to them. But then some fraction is disparity. This is the operation of the healthcare system and the legal and regulatory climate. We would not want to set up a system that disadvantaged any group in our society ex ante due to workings of the natural or the social lottery with respect to the access of healthcare that they got. Or it could represent provider discrimination, such as bias, stereotyping, and uncertainty, which I'll talk to you about in just a moment, most of which we also would not want to allow. We would not want to say it's okay for doctors, for their own reasons, to discriminate against patients based on attributes of the patients. And it's also worth noting that sometimes whites receive more services, perhaps even for bad reasons, but they wind up being harmed by this and are decidedly not better off as a result. This is not to excuse any prejudice. It's just to say that it may be a good thing in some studies to have an objective standard of appropriateness rather than merely looking at the black-white difference. We will have done minorities no favors if we roll out to them ineffective or dangerous forms of medical care. In other words, just because there's a black-white difference doesn't mean our objective should be to bring the black rate up to the white rate. It might be to bring the white rate down to the black rate if it's a harmful form of care. We need some objective way of deciding, is this the right thing to do or not simply look at any differences in delivery or preferences. Well, let's look at the idea that minorities' preferences regarding care might play a role in part of the difference. This is an old classic study from your reading. It took 800 subjects who were older than 65 and who self-identified in various ethnic and racial groups, and they were surveyed about their preferences with respect to various aspects of medical care. Many students in this class will be from these ethnic backgrounds, and many of them will find the descriptions here true to life, imagining their grandmother, their Korean or Mexican or black or white grandmother, imagining their grandmother, grandfather, they'll say, yeah, that's how my grandparents would on average behave. The slide shows the percentage of African, European, Korean, and Mexican Americans who think that a physician should inform the patient that they have cancer, the diagnosis, and that they will probably die, the prognosis. So we look at the percent of subjects who think the doctor should tell patients about diagnosis and prognosis. Here's African Americans think that the doctors should do it a lot. And here's white Americans. The black-white difference is very small in what they think the doctors should tell them about the diagnosis and prognosis. But Korean Americans and Mexican Americans don't feel that way on average. They think actually the doctor should not tell the patient, but rather the patient's family should withhold information from the patient. And in fact, the same reading showed that there was ethnic variation regarding beliefs about whether the decision to put a patient on a life support machine should be made by the patient, the physician, the family, or someone else. And in fact, on average, African Americans have an increased taste for ICU care and a decreased taste for hospice care or COVID-19 vaccines, for example. Now, again, some of this difference may relate to the history of racism in our society that disadvantage these groups. But we get to the point today where we go and we ask people, what would you like? And blacks might say, I am more interested in getting ICU care than whites, whatever the historical reason. But that's a patient level factor, right? That is not any longer the workings of a current system that is somehow denying whites access to ICU care or something like that, okay? It's differences in black versus white preferences. But there could also, in fact, be discrimination by providers, in fact, which may be divided into three further types. So these are the types, a way of thinking about what does it mean if doctors treat people of different groups differently. One possibility is bias. Bias is a prejudicial way of treating minority groups with lower regard than non-minorities by virtue of holding negative views. Stereotyping is a different thing. It's a cognitive heuristic or judgment based on group membership without a necessarily negative intent. For example, minorities are less likely to comply with treatment, which might be an empirically true description about the world. Or minorities prefer expensive invasive treatments, which is true. That's a true empirical description of the world. If you survey people about with scenarios or you look at preferences for ICU admission and so on, you regularly find that minorities want more of that. So a doctor forming the opinion that on average, blacks are more likely to want admission to an ICU than whites is not engaged in bias. That's a stereotype, right? It's assignment of a group level property to an individual, which also can be problematic, but it's not a bias. It's different, a different thing. And last, and a difficult and subtle idea, is the notion of uncertainty, which is that there can be greater difficulty in interpreting symptoms in one group compared to another. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So stereotypes, according to social psychologists, refer to the process by which people use social categories in acquiring, processing, and recalling information about others. All people do this, of whatever sex, age, race, class background. This is a human trait. But in practice, it can be very difficult to distinguish from bias, unfortunately. Well, let's flesh this out a little bit more. Basically, what you see on this picture are histograms of illness severity for two groups, with cut points indicating when the doctor would treat the patient at a fixed level of severity, in this case resulting in the treatment of more whites. So for example, let's say this is the distribution of illness severity in blacks, okay? And let's say in whites, this is the distribution of illness severity. So on average, whites are sicker than blacks of this condition. Does everyone understand still? And the doctor is unbiased, and he or she has this fixed standard. And he or she says, if you're sicker than this, whether you're black or white, I treat you. I admit you to the ICU, I prescribe a medicine for you, whatever it is that I'm going to do. We might come along afterwards and find that whites are much more often treated than blacks, but this would not be any bias. This is a benevolent doctor acting rationally with a fixed cut point and saying, if you exceed this threshold for severity of illness, whether you're black or white, I assign you to treatment. So a benevolent doctor with complete information treats only those patients, and all of them, who would derive a positive benefit from treatment. Here, more whites are treated than blacks, but there's no bias. A biased doctor assigns treatments to blacks at a lower rate than whites or at a higher severity level, given the same severity distribution. So now here imagine that the severity density for blacks and whites overlaps and is the same. A biased doctor says, if you're white, I'll treat you at this threshold, but if you're black, I'll treat you at a higher threshold. Now we once again observe more whites treated than blacks, but now this is not the workings of a benevolent doctor, this is the workings of a biased doctor. Do you understand? A confused or uncertain doctor makes mistakes, but he or she does not mean to. And this is very subtle. For example, if the symptoms in minorities are a less reliable indicator of the existence or severity of the disease, hold on, let me just see where I am here. So if the symptoms in minorities are a less reliable indicator of the existence or severity of disease, there could be miscommunication between patients and doctors could assign treatment to minorities with error. This is also known as the problem of uncertainty, and it can in fact contribute to discrimination. In this situation, for example, there's more dispersion in blacks in their symptoms given a particular disease. So blacks and whites have the same average severity, but there's more variation in blacks than whites. Can you see that this bell curve, the average for the whites and the blacks is the same, but the black curve is flatter and more widely distributed than the white curve. And there's more people at the top and on the bottom. And given this increased uncertainty, because the doctor can be less sure that a given level of illness severity is indicative of the disease in blacks compared to whites, the doctor may set a higher threshold for treatment if symptoms in a minority person are less likely to be indicative of disease. And in fact, a higher threshold may thus be warranted. In this reasoning, I need to be very clear so I'm not misunderstood. In this situation, in order to capture the same fraction of patients. In other words, if you look what's happening here, the doctor says, okay, if you're white, I'll treat you at this lower level of severity, and then we're going to get, I don't know, 20% of the patients. And if you're Black, I'm going to treat you at this higher threshold, but once again, capture 20% of the patients. Do you understand? We might come along and say, wait a minute, this is unjust. The doctor is setting a higher threshold for treatment for Blacks than whites, and we might also happen to notice there's no difference in the treatment percentages, but that's different. But the reason might be precisely because of the flatter distribution, even though the average, the mean severity is the same for the two populations. Let me just see here if I can switch so I can see your faces. Let me see if I can make this work. Let's see here. How do I stop share? 1 second here. I hope I can go back to sharing in a moment. Are there any questions so far? No questions? Yes. Severin.
How are we able to make these distinguishing factors, like when it's like a real life scenario or someone, as opposed to like a perfect data that we're getting?
Yeah, it's really hard, right? This is the problem. So what you can see is I put on the table before you two problems. First is the conceptual model you bring to bear on like how race is working. That's a whole problem. Now we have the fact that different underlying phenomena of differing legitimacy could yield the same empirical observation. So how can you know? In a moment, I'll show you some experiments that can begin to tease apart, for example, finding some evidence of bias in doctors. Other questions? You can raise your hands. I can see 25 of you right now on my screen. And if you raise your hands, I think Maggie can see you or call on you. Any other questions? All right, let me see if I can, no, I need to go back to Zoom. Let's see here. And share screen. Share. And then presenter view. And then I need to give myself the annotation tool. All right, are we back?
Hey, Nicholas, we have a question.
Yeah, Chloe.
I was just wondering, like, what are some examples of factors that can account for the greater variabilities in symptoms compared, like, in races, like differences in races?
It could or could not, and it could be other groups defined in other categories. So there could be biological differences, for example, in the functioning of your pancreas, or we'll get to it later in the disease, why certain viruses cause certain outcomes in Japanese and different outcomes in Americans, for example. So there could be differences like of that nature. Or there could be other things, for instance, that have to do with, for example, socioeconomic status that affect, you have a weaker body or a heavier body. Let's say Blacks on average are more overweight, which is true than whites. It may be more difficult to detect a signal in people with bigger bodies, let's say. So there are a host of different things that could lead to it. But the important point is, I'm not making yet strong empirical claims. I'm just educating you to the fact that other phenomena, other than strict bias, could give rise to these types of problems. So we got to really think carefully and clearly about this. It's not so simple that, oh, we see a black-white difference and we're like, oh, that's awful. No, we need to be a bit more careful. Yes, Colin.
I had like a clarification question and
Yeah.
then it's like a curiosity question. So essentially what like the data is showing us is that like the hard truth is that like we can't treat all races equally because that in itself could be discrimination or misuse of treatment. And if that statement is true, are there current like diversification or like diversity training amongst like healthcare providers in order to like help with this disparity?
Well, no, I would not frame it as saying we shouldn't treat all races equally. I wouldn't frame it that way because that begs the outcome. I would say people should be treated fairly and appropriately, conditional on their desires. So just because we see a difference doesn't mean, as the slide 3 or 4 slides ago showed, let me see if I can get to that slide. Our goal is not to eliminate this difference. Our goal is to make sure we don't have disparity. We don't have unjust operation of the healthcare system, or that among provider discrimination, we eliminate bias. This phenomenon of stereotyping and uncertainty, stereotyping is not necessarily bad, it can be bad, and uncertainty is a phenomenon that has to do with the patients themselves. It's not the doctor doing something wrong. You wouldn't want necessarily, it depends on the disease, you wouldn't want the doctor necessarily to countermand that, because they might overtreat patients and wind up killing more people by giving them more treatment than they need, for instance. Moreover, it's not so simple, and in fact, I'll show you in just a moment, it's not so simple as just, giving some kind of training to the doctors, because in fact, well, I'll show you in just a moment. Chloe, you still have your hand up, or you took it down?
I took it
Oh.
down now.
All right. So what's the evidence regarding discrimination? I think I can summarize the work of McGuire and his colleagues have done in this area. They find that there is some limited evidence for bias, but nevertheless, patients do report experiences of discrimination. With respect to stereotyping, evidence suggests that physicians do use these cognitive shortcuts. And with respect to uncertainty, evidence suggests that doctors do use race in a probabilistic way to make diagnoses and implement treatments in a kind of statistical discrimination. So if the same symptoms presenting in a person of one or another ethno-racial background might in fact have different meaning, and doctors might be using it in the fashion shown here. And in fact, stereotypes may be true, they may also be favorable, but it still may be very hard to accept them. And most importantly, individuals are not groups. Every patient deserves to be treated as a human being without any kind of prejudicial operation, either of the doctors or of the healthcare system. And of course, I think going now to Colin's question, what evidence do we have of different kinds of bias and discrimination and racism in our society affecting health outcomes? No doubt there's discrimination in our society and in our healthcare system, and it can harm people's health. A very clever study in this area done by epidemiologist Diane Lauderdale was in your readings. She studied a sample of all babies born in California in the 6 months after 9/11 compared to the same 6 months the year before. And she computed the ratio of the risk of low birth weight in the two time periods. So what was your risk of being born small if you were born in the 6 months after 9/11 compared to the 6 months a year earlier for each ethnic group? And she found no change in any of the groups except for Arab Americans. So she looks at mother's race, ethnicity, or nativity. And for example, she looks at all non-Hispanic whites, and she finds that the risk of being low birth weight in the 6 months after 9/11 is not elevated. You're not more likely to be born small if you're white, born to a white mother after 9/11. This shows the p-value and the confidence interval. No effect if you're non-Hispanic Black. No effect if you're Asian or Pacific Islander. No effect if you're Native American. Having a Native American mom didn't affect whether you were born small or not before versus after 9/11. No effect if you're Hispanic, but if you're Arabic, there's an effect. In fact, Arabic named women, their babies had a 34% higher likelihood of being born small in the period after 9/11, when there was a lot of anti-Arab discrimination in our society, compared to the same period a year earlier when there was much less anti-Arab discrimination. Furthermore, in a kind of ingenious twist, what Lauderdale does is she says, well, what if I use the name of the baby as a marker of how important the ethnicity is to the mother? So mothers choosing extremely traditional names, they might be more committed to public displays of their ethnicity and their religion. For example, if you were Muslim, you might be more likely to be dressed in a cover your body if you were a woman. And women like that, Lauderdale reasons, might be more likely to give their offspring more traditional names, and also to be subject to more discrimination because they're more visibly of this type. And in fact, she finds just that if your infant's given name was ethnically distinctive, you had especially high risk of being born small. So how can we explore whether doctors discriminate? whether due to bias, stereotyping, or uncertainty. So let's imagine now this is an experimental study of race, sex, and age effects on doctors' treatment recommendations. These are photographs of 4 actors, okay? This is a woman and this is a man. This is an older person, a younger, and this is older here at the bottom. Now you could just ask people if they discriminate, perhaps due to bias or prejudice. So you could go and ask doctors, do you discriminate against people because of their sex or their race or their age? And what would the doctors say? They'd say, no, I don't do that. So how can you figure out if they are doing that? Well, you can do an experiment. These photos accompanied an experiment involving 720 physicians who watched a video of an actor describing some chest pain symptoms. But different actors were shown, always telling the same story. And then the physicians were asked to do a bunch of things after being shown these videos. One of the things they were asked to do was to estimate the likelihood that the patient, based on the symptoms they described, actually had coronary artery disease. And the other was to decide whether or not the patient should have a cardiac catheterization, a test to decide whether they did in fact have coronary artery disease. And this test can be risky and may or may not be appropriate. The first thing the physicians did is estimate the probability of coronary artery disease before the results of another test, a stress test, were given to them. And these differences in the doctor's estimate of the likelihood of coronary artery disease differed according to the sex, age, and history of the patients in ways that were not surprising. So the same symptoms in a 70-year-old man mean something very different than those symptoms in a 30-year-old woman. We would not be surprised if the doctor said, oh, a 30-year-old man with these symptoms, 70-year-old man with these symptoms is more likely, in fact, to have coronary artery disease. And the pattern of these differences were consistent with the known prevalence of coronary artery disease in the various groups of patients. But then, crucially, in the vignette, the doctors were given a test result confirming the presence of coronary artery disease. They were given a stress test result. And now they were asked, would you order a catheterization? And the answer is yes, you need to do that now because you've effaced, let's say, most of the difference due to age, sex, or race. These are the Black patients that were shown. These are the analogous Black actors that were shown. And here are the key results of the study. This shows the mean referral rate for this necessary test by sex and race in the situation after the doctors were told the results of the stress test. Men were more likely to be sent than women, and whites were more likely to be sent than Blacks. At this point, there shouldn't be a difference anymore operating. There's a slight but detectable difference in referral rates for catheterization, even in the face of a positive test result confirming the likely presence of coronary artery disease. And cumulatively, at the population level, such effects would indeed add up. Now let's turn to another interesting set of findings from your readings. These investigators looked at the healthcare use of millions of patients spread out over 79 broad regions in the United States. This is a very important study full of subtlety, of high relevance to understanding the play of discrimination and disparities in American healthcare. Because differences in healthcare, it turns out, are driven more by residence than by race. More generally, average disparities are driven by the fact that Blacks tend to live disproportionately in regions of low overall rates for both Blacks and whites. So equalizing rates within regions would not reduce disparities nationally. See, if you made the Black-white difference go away state by state, if Blacks are more likely to live in states that have low levels of healthcare, you might still not fix the problem at a national level. Moreover, these investigators also found that a region with small racial disparities in one procedure is just as likely to have a high disparity in other procedures, which subverts the idea that there's some kind of systematic prejudice by doctors. If doctors were discriminating against, let's say, Black patients compared to white patients, you should see a depression for all procedures, not just for some and not others, right? There should be some kind of systematic racism in that kind of healthcare system, but that's not what the data show. Furthermore, as shown on this slide regarding a very simple, cheap, but important test in diabetics, the test for hemoglobin A1C, or sugar-coated red blood cells, like we discussed a couple of lectures ago, regions with the smallest racial disparities are not necessarily the ones providing the best available care for Black patients. So this shows the Black-white differences in hemoglobin A1C evaluation for diabetics in 79 hospital referral regions. This shows the percent of Blacks having the test. And if you're a diabetic, you should always have this test. More is better. And this shows the percent of whites having the test on the x-axis. This diagonal line shows the line of no disparity. So for example, this municipality here means there's no difference. Both Blacks and whites get the test at the same rate, 65% or whatever it is. These cities here, Blacks get more of the test. This is a good test to get. This is not a bad thing. If it were a bad thing, we would be saying, whoa, that's not good that Blacks are getting more of it, but it's a good thing to get. And these municipalities, 1, 2, and this one, Blacks get more of it. But of course, in most of the municipalities, the zone where whites have more is here. Now here in Washington, D.C., there's a huge disparity between Blacks and whites, a 14% percentage point difference between the rate at which Blacks get the test, which is whatever it is, 72%, which is 60% right there. This is the percent of Blacks getting the test versus whites, which is, let's say, 74%. So a big difference. In Chicago, there's greater equality. There's a smaller difference between Blacks and whites in getting the test. But if you're Black, you would still be better off being in Washington than in Chicago when it comes to the hemoglobin A1C test. You'd be more likely to get it. And in fact, there's more dispersion along the line than up and down. That is, there's more variation and disparities between regions than within regions. The big factor determining whether you have access to this test, if you're a minority, is where you live, right? Across regions, rather than your skin color. Finally, the conclusion in the study that you read is that large racial disparities in surgery are often the result of high white rates rather than low Black rates when judged by an external standards of appropriateness. In other words, whites get overtreated with useless and needless surgery. We will not be doing Blacks any favor by equalizing the rates in that type of a situation. So we need some kind of objective standard before we decide what to do. In fact, the story is very complicated. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not alert you to the complexities in studying the relationship of race and ethnicity and health in another way. There is something known as the Hispanic paradox. And this came up last week in the SIDS back to sleep example. Because of the composition by socioeconomic traits, the health and mortality profile in Hispanics is expected to resemble that of African Americans more closely than that of non-Hispanic whites, but it does not. In fact, Hispanics do better than both Blacks and whites on most measures of health. It's a paradox in the sense that expectations are not consistent with observation. And in fact, there's a Hispanic paradox in most health metrics, in birth weight, infant mortality, adult mortality, late onset health, and so on. And here's some data on the survival advantage of Hispanics. This line shows non-Hispanic whites. So this is years of life expectancy by age. If you're a 50-year-old white person, you might have 32 years of life left. If you're a foreign-born Mexican, you might have 37 years of life left. And if you're a foreign-born other Hispanic, you might have, 40 years of life expectancy left. So these are very big differences showing a Hispanic advantage. So there are two hypotheses regarding the origins of the Hispanic paradox. One is known as the healthy migrant effect. I think this goes back a little bit to what Chloe said. Is another way in which the dispersion might be different by groups. And here, Hispanic migrants are selected from an origin population for certain traits, including better physical and psychological health. It's very difficult to migrate, whether legally or illegally. You have to really be brave, be smart, be strong. It's not easy. Or in fact have certain opportunities. You know, the desperately poor in a given society may be completely unable to migrate, but some with a little bit of wealth may be better able. So they already may be better off even before migration. Or for a host of reasons, natural and social lottery reasons. Or there could be something known as the salmon bias effect, which is that migrants from some Hispanic subgroups may return to their country of origin following a period of temporary unemployment and or illness in the United States. Here the idea is that certain Hispanic groups may go home to die. So it may be a fiction. The Hispanic paradox may in fact be a kind of artifact of the data, where what's happening is just before a sick Hispanic person's about to die, they return to Mexico and die in Mexico. So we don't find them in our data. This is actually not trivial to sort all this out, and there's a huge demographic literature on this, but the bottom line is that Hispanics live longer than whites in our country for a combination of both of these reasons. Oh, I'm sorry. And of course, there are other reasons as well, including the fact that the diet and family structure of Hispanics is very different. On average, Hispanics eat better and have more supportive families, let's say, than whites. Let's look at one final set of ideas. There's something which probably many of you have heard called the implicit association test, which actually was originally developed at Yale. And it's a social psychology measure designed to detect the strength of a person's automatic association between mental representations and concepts in their memory. It's a computer-based measure that requires users to rapidly categorize two target concepts with an attribute, such that easier pairings, faster responses, are interpreted as more strongly associated in memory than more difficult pairings, slower responses. And raise your hands if you've ever taken an IET test. Online, they're widely available online. They're interesting to take. So Maggie, have most of the class taken it, I'm imagining? You can go
Hands
online.
are coming in, but it looks like most.
Yeah, so most people have taken these tests by now. They're online websites that you can use where you can take it. You'll get a very intuitive appreciation for how the test works if you actually take it. So, so if the task is easier, faster, then we suppose that the pairing makes implicit sense to you, and this may suggest a possible bias. Now, the IAT can be used in a number of ways, but one use is to enable researchers to get around the difficult problem of social desirability bias, and which is like, if you ask people, do you discriminate against drug users or do you discriminate against minorities? They'll say, of course not, but maybe they do. So how can you tell? This test can, it is thought, can be a way to assess that and to assess people's attitudes towards commonly stigmatized groups. Now, a typical IAT procedure involves a series of tasks. In the first task, an individual is asked to categorize stimuli into two categories. For example, a person might be presented with a computer screen on which the word black appears in the top left-hand corner and the word white appears in the top right-hand corner. And in the middle of the screen is a word, and the respondent is asked, for example, to sort this word into appropriate category by pressing a left-hand or right-hand key. And then on the second task, the person would complete a similar sorting procedure, for example, with photos of black and white people, for example. And on the third task, individuals then are asked to complete a combined task that includes both the categories and attributes from the first two tasks. And in this example, the words black and good might appear in the top left-hand corner, while the words white and bad would appear in the top right-hand corner. And individuals would then see a series of stimuli in the center of the screen consisting of either photos or a word. And they would be asked to press the left-hand key if the name or word belongs to the black good category, or right if it belongs to the white bad. Then the order would be reversed and scrambled, and we would assess when the sorting task was easier for the respondent. And the test measures whether it is easier or faster for you to categorize pictures and words when the categories in the upper left and right are concordant in your mind. So for example, if it's easier for you to categorize this when it says black people or good versus white people or bad, or if we flip the white, the good and the bad, and then it becomes easier, then we make an inference about how you have an implicit association, let's say, between black people and good or between black people and bad, and so on. or white people in bad and white people in good. And it turns out that everyone, black and white, all human beings have biases. And the work by psychologist Mazrin Banaji and her colleagues suggests the widespread presence of such unconscious bias, at least when it's measured in this way. These are results regarding implicit and explicit attitudes towards race, measured in the form of effect sizes by something known as Cohen's D, separately for black and white respondents. So this is the preference for whites over blacks using explicit and implicit measures. So you ask white people and black people, do you prefer whites or blacks? And whites say, oh, I prefer whites. And blacks say, I prefer blacks. This is classic in-group bias, in-group racism. People prefer their own groups, regardless of who they are or what group they are. But then if you do the implicit test, you find that whites have an even higher rating compared to this, but fascinatingly, so do blacks. Blacks have a slight preference for white, an implicit preference for whites as well. The strong explicit liking reported by black respondents for their own group stands in sharp contrast to the performance on implicit measures. White respondents showed a strong preference for white over black, but black respondents also showed an admittedly weak preference for white over black. So it was easier for them also to categorize negative words when they were paired, for example, with black. And you can see how this works if you go to a website. There are lots of theories and explanations for why some of this might work, so-called internalized racism and so on, but actually it's not so simple if you begin to scratch the surface of how these experiments are done and what they mean. Now, many, many studies since the introduction of the IAT have shown that while many or most people, black or white, have biases, they often or even usually do not act on them. This is very important to understand. And for obvious reasons, such studies have focused on physicians too. So the question is, not do people have biases, because all human beings have biases. The question is, does the cop act on this bias? Does the teacher act on this bias? Is the teacher not calling on little black boys compared to little white girls more, which would be wrong and inappropriate? Does the doctor act differently? So what we care about is the actions of actors, not what's in their minds so much, especially since all human beings have these, black or white, have these biases. And studies have looked at this in doctors. There were 9 studies involving physicians that measured bias using the IAT and then went and looked at their clinical practice, either by giving them hypothetical vignettes or actually pulling their charts and seeing, did doctors with different levels of bias treat patients differently in reality? All 9 studies confirmed the presence of IAT measured bias at the upper end of the slight bias range, favoring white patients, though pediatricians had lower levels of bias. Pediatricians are always the nicest doctors. But 7 of the studies found no correlation between IAT bias and physician practice. 2 studies found possible but not conclusive evidence of effects on practice in terms of clinical decision-making. And here is this meta-analysis if you're interested in these details in the reference. So many prior studies have been unable to make a link between explicit bias and physician behavior. But if conscious bias doesn't have an effect, how could unconscious bias have one? In other words, even when doctors tell you that they prefer one group over another, we still don't find that they treat those groups differently. So if that's true, then how could, if their conscious bias isn't having an effect, how can their unconscious bias even have an effect? Moreover, recent work has shown that training people about their biases does not appear to change their bias, and in some case may worsen beliefs and practices by raising the salience of factors such as race that previously did not loom large in their minds. There was a recent study looking at workplace bias training, 500 different companies looking around the country, and it found that generally speaking, mandatory training for implicit bias actually made the situation worse by highlighting differences in the workplace that people generally weren't paying so much attention to before. So let me be very clear. Human beings of all kinds manifest in-group bias, a preference for their own group. And this is sad and often perturbing, and it can lead to all kinds of evil if extreme. But what we really should be doing, in my view, is focusing on making sure that any such bias doesn't modify people's actions and doesn't lead to harm, because we cannot tolerate this type of discriminatory practice in the delivery of healthcare in our society. So in studying race, we've seen that various types of factors can account for health disparities. And when we are studying the effect of various socioeconomic factors in health, we want to be able to focus both on the individual and their agency, but we want to focus on the structure as well. And we want to avoid a cognitive and moral trap of losing the proper focus. The study of why some people swim well and others drown when they are tossed into the water displaces study of who is tossing whom into the current and what else might be in the water. Compared to a man sitting safely in a boat, is this man experiencing an unequal outcome, or is he the victim of unequal treatment, which we on no account should allow? Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Colin, I can see you guys now.
I just was a little confused about the last metaphor. Could you go into more detail?
Yeah, the idea is we might sit here and look at this guy and say he's drowning, but it's not our fault. He just never learned to swim. He's a fool. But wait a minute, maybe he was thrown into the water by an unfair system, right? It's not about him, it's about the system. Or maybe he's swimming in water full of sharks and you and I are not. That's not right. You understand? So the metaphor, the point is that you need to expand your mind and understand when you look at something, what's really going on? Is it just him? Is it someone threw him into the water? Is he in a different environment than the rest of us? And all of these things, of course, are happening in our society, right? It's not, we're not a perfect society. Of course, we have racial injustice in our society, but it's not always so simple. When you see it, a difference, it's not always reflects some kind of invidious workings of the healthcare system, for all the reasons I hope you understood today. Yes, did I answer your question, Colin?
Yes, you did.
Maggie.
Yeah, hi. I just noticed that they measured lower rates of SIDS in the Hispanic populations as well. And it seems like the hypotheses that we talked about with the Hispanic paradox wouldn't really apply to infant death. So I was just wondering if there are any theories on that, like cultural sleeping preferences or what kind of going on there?
The SIDS is less common in Hispanics. I think that was in a lecture or two ago.
Right.
For reasons that we don't know, it may relate to prior baseline probability of putting the kids back to sleep. It may relate to differences in the distribution of birth weights. It may reflect differences in co-sleeping arrangements. So if you're Hispanic and you're more likely to have your baby right next to you in bed with you, the mother might detect that the baby stopped breathing. Whereas, in a white family, they might be in a different room, for example. So there are many possible explanations for why that might happen. The point of that slide and that illustration a couple of lectures ago was to show that even though the Back to Sleep campaign reduced everyone's rate of dying, it widened the disparities because whites were more likely to respond to it than minority groups were. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. I was curious about those extra factors like the co-sleeping and stuff.
Yes, we don't always know. And this is also the subtle thing too, because even so-called cultural factors can be difficult. Like if you have, let's say there are cultural factors so-called cultural factors that explain why minority kids might be less likely to want to succeed at school. Well, we could say on the one hand, well, they don't want to succeed at school. That's their choice and their parents' choice. The Asian kids in New York City, their parents are drilling them and that's why they're thriving. And the minority kids don't want to do that. So that's not our problem. Well, we might not like that either, right? We might ask, what's the origin of this cultural preference? But then you get into difficulties where you're saying, well, I'm going to judge other cultures for their preferences. We have reached a point in our society where we're not able, in my view, to speak properly with nuance about these topics. Everyone is so worried about these things and about being misunderstood that we're not talking honestly. And that interferes with our ability to address inequities when they must be addressed and not mind them when they don't need to be meddled with. Other questions or comments? Okay, Maggie, do you have anything to say?
Fill out the survey if you haven't yet.
Please do so by 5 o'clock today. And then we'll pick up next time. Emily Martin's book, which you're reading for next time, is one of the most magnificent things I have ever read. And if you don't read the first 60 pages, I promise you, it'll blow your mind if you read the first 60 pages. So please do the assigned reading, and we will enjoy next week's lecture. Next time's lecture, I guarantee it. Ciao.
Bye, everyone.